Hey guys, tonight we're diving into why you absolutely wouldn't survive the Wild West. And trust me, it's nothing like the movies show you. Forget the romanticized gunfights and heroic cowboys. We're talking about a place where a simple cut could kill you, where most towns were just 3 buildings and a lot of mud, where you'd be lucky to eat meat once a month, where bathing meant splashing creek water on your face if you were lucky enough to find a creek that wasn't dried up or contaminated with cattle waste. Most people died from things we don't even think about today. We're talking about a time when the average lifespan was 35 years old, when a broken leg meant death, when most cowboys were actually broke teenagers trying not to starve. The real Wild West was dirty, smelly, dangerous, and absolutely nothing like what Hollywood wants you to believe. Tonight, we're going to walk through exactly what your day would look like if you somehow found yourself in 1870s frontier America, from the moment you wake up in a flea-infested bedroll to the terrifying sounds that kept people awake at night. So get comfortable in your modern bed, with your clean sheets and central heating, and let me tell you the real story of frontier survival that will make you grateful for every convenience you have today as we slowly drift into the harsh but fascinating world of the actual American frontier.
Let's start with how your day would begin in the Wild West. And I promise you, it's nothing like waking up in your comfortable bed right now. Picture this. It's 4:30 in the morning, and there's no alarm clock gently buzzing you awake. Instead, you're jolted from whatever fitful sleep you managed to get by the sound of a rooster crowing somewhere in the distance, mixed with the lowing of cattle and the harsh voice of someone shouting orders across the camp. You're not lying on a mattress. You're on the hard ground, wrapped in a wool blanket that's probably crawling with fleas, ticks, and God knows what else. The blanket itself weighs about 15 pounds when it's dry, which it rarely is because morning dew has soaked through everything you own. Your clothes are damp, your boots are damp, and that uncomfortable dampness is going to stay with you for most of the day. The temperature has dropped to maybe 40 degrees overnight, even though it's going to hit 95 by noon. That's the thing about the frontier that movies never show you, the incredible temperature swings. Your teeth are chattering, your muscles are stiff from sleeping on rocks and tree roots, and every joint in your body aches like you've been hit by a truck. But here's the real kicker. You can't just lie there and gradually wake up like you do now. The moment consciousness hits, you need to be moving, because if you're not up and working, you're not eating. And in a place where food is scarce and expensive, missing a meal could literally mean the difference between life and death. So you force yourself to sit up, and immediately your back screams in protest. Sleeping on the ground for months does things to your spine that would horrify a modern chiropractor. You look around at your surroundings, and it's nothing like the picturesque western towns you see in movies. If you're lucky enough to be near what passes for a town, you're looking at maybe 6 or 7 buildings total. There's probably a general store that doubles as a post office, a saloon that's really just a tent with some barrels serving as tables, maybe a blacksmith shop, and that's about it. The streets aren't paved. They're just dirt paths that turn into knee-deep mud when it rains and choking dust clouds when it's dry. The smell hits you next, and this is something Hollywood absolutely never prepares you for. The Wild West stank. I mean, really, truly reeked in ways that would make you physically ill today. There's no sewage system, so human waste is just dumped wherever convenient. Dead animals are left to rot where they fall. The combination of unwashed human bodies, rotting meat, animal manure, and stagnant water creates an odor so overwhelming that newcomers to frontier towns often vomited just from the smell. But you can't focus on the smell for long because your stomach is already cramping with hunger. You haven't eaten since yesterday afternoon, and that meal was probably just beans and hardtack, a type of biscuit so hard it could break your teeth if you tried to bite it without soaking it in water first. Real meat was a luxury most frontier people saw maybe once or twice a month if they were lucky. You stagger to your feet, and your boots are still damp from yesterday's creek crossing. Wet leather boots in the Wild West weren't just uncomfortable, they were dangerous. Constantly damp feet led to fungal infections, trench foot, and open sores that could easily become infected and kill you. But you can't afford new boots, and even if you could, the nearest place to buy them might be 100 miles away. The first task of every day is finding water, and this is where your modern assumptions would get you killed fast. You see a stream or a pond and your instinct is to drink from it, right? Wrong. That water is probably contaminated with cattle waste, dead animals, or worse. Cholera, dysentery, and typhoid fever spread through bad water, and any one of those diseases had a good chance of killing you in an era before antibiotics. But you have to drink something, so you make your way to whatever water source is available, hoping for the best. You cup the murky liquid in your hands. There are no cups or bottles, just your dirty palms, and you drink it, despite the taste of mud and the suspicious chunks floating in it. This single act, something as basic as getting a drink of water, just put your life at risk in ways you can't even imagine. Next comes breakfast, if you can call it that. If you're working as a cowboy, and remember, most cowboys were teenage boys, not the grizzled heroes Hollywood shows us, your breakfast is probably beans that have been sitting in a pot since yesterday, maybe some bacon if the outfit you're working for isn't completely broke, and coffee that's more like liquid mud. The coffee deserves special mention because it was absolutely crucial to frontier life, but it bore no resemblance to what you're used to. Coffee beans were expensive and hard to get, so what passed for coffee was often made from roasted barley, chicory, or even acorns. When real coffee was available, it was boiled in the same pot for days, getting stronger and more bitter with each brewing. The resulting liquid was thick enough to float a horseshoe and bitter enough to make you wince, but it was hot and it contained caffeine, so you choked it down. While you're trying to stomach this awful breakfast, you're also dealing with insects that would drive a modern person insane. Flies swarm around everything, especially anything edible. There's no refrigeration, so all food is either dried, salted, or canned, and flies lay eggs in everything. You quickly learn to eat without looking too closely at your food because seeing the maggots would make it impossible to get the nutrition you desperately need. Mosquitoes are another constant torment, especially near water sources. But these aren't just annoying, they carry diseases like malaria and yellow fever. A mosquito bite in the Wild West could literally kill you, and there was no effective protection against them. Some people tried smoking pipes constantly to keep insects away, but this was only partially effective and came with its own health risks. As you're choking down this awful breakfast and swatting at flies, you hear horses approaching. This sound, which might seem exciting or romantic in a movie, actually fills you with dread. Unknown riders approaching your camp could mean anything from robbers to hostile Native Americans or just desperate people who might kill you for your food and supplies. You grab whatever weapon you have, maybe a rifle if you're lucky, more likely just a knife or a club, and wait to see what happens. This hypervigilance, this constant state of alertness to potential danger, is something that would exhaust modern people within days. There were no police to call, no 911 to dial, no safe places to run to. Your survival depended entirely on your ability to defend yourself and your group. The riders turn out to be harmless this time. Maybe just other travelers looking for directions or wanting to share news from other settlements. But the adrenaline rush of fear leaves you shaky and even more exhausted than you already were. This cycle of fear and relief happens multiple times every day in the Wild West, wearing down your nerves and your body in ways that would break most modern people within weeks. Now it's time to start the real work of the day, and this is where your modern body would completely fail you. If you're working cattle, you're looking at 12 to 16 hours in the saddle, under the blazing sun. If you're trying to establish a homestead, you're facing endless hours of back-breaking manual labor, clearing land, building shelter, digging wells, all without power tools or machinery. The physical demands were absolutely crushing. Cowboys regularly lost 20 to 30 pounds during cattle drives, despite eating whenever food was available. Farmers worked from dawn to dusk and still barely produced enough food to survive. The sheer physical exhaustion of frontier life was something that killed people just as surely as bullets or disease. But perhaps the most dangerous aspect of your morning routine would be your complete lack of medical knowledge. That small cut on your hand from yesterday? In your modern life, you'd clean it with antiseptic, maybe put on a bandage, and forget about it. In the Wild West, that same cut could become infected, lead to blood poisoning, and kill you within a week. There were no antibiotics, no sterile medical supplies, and precious few doctors. Most frontier medical care was provided by whoever in the community had picked up a little knowledge along the way. Treatments ranged from useless to actively harmful. Mercury was commonly used to treat various ailments, slowly poisoning patients. Bloodletting was still practiced, weakening people who were already struggling to survive. Surgery was performed without anesthesia or sterile conditions, and most patients died from infection even if the operation itself was successful. As your first morning in the Wild West continues, you begin to realize that everything you thought you knew about this period was wrong. The cowboys weren't heroic loners. They were mostly scared kids trying to make enough money to survive. The towns weren't bustling centers of civilization. They were desperate, lawless settlements where life was cheap and justice was whatever the strongest men decided it was. The landscape itself was your enemy in ways that movies never convey. The sun wasn't romantically warming, it was a blazing furnace that could kill you through heat stroke or skin cancer. The wide open spaces weren't freedom, they were vast, empty wastes where you could die of thirst or exposure with no one around to help you. The horses weren't noble companions, they were expensive, temperamental animals that required constant care and could leave you stranded and doomed if they were injured or stolen. By the time the sun is fully up on your first morning in the Wild West, you're already exhausted, hungry, thirsty, scared, and in pain. And this is just the beginning of what promises to be another 16-hour day of struggle for survival.
The reality is that most people who tried to make it on the frontier didn't. They died of disease, starvation, exposure, violence, or simple accidents that would be minor inconveniences today, but were death sentences in an era without modern medicine or emergency services. Those who did survive often lived lives of such hardship and deprivation that they aged decades in just a few years. So as you lie there in your comfortable bed tonight, with your climate control and clean water and abundant food just steps away, remember that you're living better than kings did just a few generations ago. The Wild West might seem romantic from a distance, but the reality was harsh, beyond anything most modern people could endure. And this was just your first morning. We haven't even talked about what happens when someone gets sick, or when winter comes, or when the food runs out. As the morning progresses and the sun climbs higher in the sky, you begin to understand why so many frontier settlers simply gave up and went back east, if they lived long enough to make that choice. The temperature that started at a bone-chilling 40 degrees at dawn is now climbing toward what will be a murderous 95 degrees by noon, and you're about to experience heat in a way that would be completely foreign to anyone living in the age of air conditioning. This isn't the pleasant warmth of sitting by a pool or lying on a beach. This is heat as a weapon, heat as an enemy, heat that wants to kill you. The sun beats down with an intensity that makes it physically painful to look at anything bright. There are no sunglasses, no sunscreen, no UV protection of any kind. Your skin begins to burn within minutes of direct exposure, and that burn will blister, peel, and possibly become infected. But you can't seek shade, because there isn't any. The frontier is mostly treeless prairie, endless miles of grass and dust, with maybe one scraggly tree every few miles. And even if you find shade, you can't stay there because the work doesn't stop. Cattle don't care that it's dangerously hot. Crops don't water themselves. The endless list of tasks required for survival continues regardless of weather conditions that would shut down most modern outdoor activities. Your clothes, which were damp and uncomfortable from dew a few hours ago, are now soaked with sweat. But this isn't the clean perspiration from a modern workout. This is sweat mixed with days or weeks of accumulated dirt, because bathing isn't really an option. Your wool shirt, the only kind of fabric sturdy enough for frontier life, becomes a soggy, stinking, scratchy prison that chafes your skin raw, but can't be removed because you need protection from the sun. The smell of your own body becomes overwhelming, but it's nothing compared to the smell of the animals you're working with. Cattle, horses, pigs, they're all suffering in the heat just like you are, but they're producing smells that would make a modern person vomit. Dead animals that couldn't handle the temperature are already starting to bloat and decompose, adding their stench to an atmosphere that's becoming literally unbreathable. Water becomes an obsession. You think about it constantly, dream about it when you can snatch a few minutes of rest. But water is scarce, precious, and usually contaminated. You ration it carefully, knowing that drinking too much from your limited supply early in the day could mean dying of thirst before evening. And when you do drink, it's warm, murky liquid that tastes of metal and dirt and things you don't want to think about. Dehydration starts affecting your judgment within hours. You become dizzy, confused, prone to making the kind of mistakes that could be fatal. You might forget to secure a rope properly, or misjudge the distance to a cliff edge, or fail to notice that a supposedly tame animal is actually aggressive and dangerous. In the modern world, dehydration means you feel lousy and maybe get a headache. On the frontier, it means you make errors that can kill you or others who depend on you. The work itself becomes a form of torture in the heat. If you're herding cattle, you're spending hours in the saddle while the sun beats down on your back and reflects up from the ground, creating a furnace effect that cooks you from both directions. The leather saddle becomes scorching hot, burning your legs even through thick pants. The metal bits and buckles on your equipment become too hot to touch with bare skin. If you're doing manual labor, building, farming, digging, every tool becomes an instrument of torture. Metal tools left in the sun can literally brand you if you grab them without thinking. Wooden handles become almost too hot to grip. The physical exertion required for the work makes you sweat even more, accelerating your dehydration and exhaustion. And through it all, you're fighting insects that become more aggressive in the heat. Flies swarm around anything organic. Your food, your animals, your own sweating body. They get in your eyes, your nose, your mouth when you're trying to breathe. Mosquitoes and other biting insects seem to multiply in the heat, and their bites become more easily infected when you're dirty and your immune system is compromised by exhaustion and poor nutrition. By midday, the combination of heat, dehydration, exhaustion, and malnutrition starts creating symptoms that would send a modern person straight to the emergency room. You might experience heat cramps, where your muscles seize up in agonizing spasms because you've lost too much salt through sweating. You might develop heat exhaustion, feeling dizzy, nauseous, and confused. Or you might progress to heat stroke, which was often fatal on the frontier, because there was no way to rapidly cool someone down or replace their fluids intravenously. The psychological effects of the heat are almost worse than the physical ones. It makes you irritable, aggressive, prone to making bad decisions. Arguments that might have been settled with words in cooler weather escalate to violence when everyone is suffering from heat-induced stress. The combination of physical discomfort and mental strain breaks down the social bonds that are essential for survival in a dangerous environment. Food becomes almost impossible to eat in the extreme heat. Your appetite disappears, but you know you need calories to keep working. The available food, beans, hardtack, dried meat, is already barely palatable under the best conditions. In the blazing heat, trying to choke down warm, salty food when you're already nauseous from heat exhaustion becomes an exercise in sheer willpower. And even worse, the heat makes food spoil even faster than usual. Meat that might have been edible in the morning becomes dangerous by afternoon. Milk sours within hours. The few fresh vegetables available wilt and rot before they can be consumed. Food poisoning, always a serious risk on the frontier, becomes almost inevitable in the heat. The animals you depend on for survival are suffering just as much as you are. Horses can die from heat stroke, leaving you stranded. Cattle become aggressive and unpredictable when they're overheated. Working animals lose their strength and stamina, making already difficult tasks nearly impossible. And if an animal dies from the heat, it creates both an economic disaster — these animals represented huge investments — and an immediate health hazard as the carcass begins to decompose in the sun. Sleep becomes impossible during the hottest part of the day, but your body desperately needs rest. You might try to find a tiny patch of shade and lie down, but the ground is too hot to touch, and there's no escape from the heat. Some frontier workers tried to sleep during the day and work at night, but this created its own dangers: nocturnal predators, the difficulty of seeing hazards in the dark, and the social isolation that came from being awake when everyone else was trying to rest. The sun doesn't just make you hot, it actively tries to kill you in ways that people didn't understand at the time. Without proper protection, skin cancer was almost inevitable for anyone who spent years working outdoors. Cataracts developed early from sun damage, leaving people partially blind by middle age. Heat stroke could cause permanent brain damage even if you survived the initial episode. As you struggle through the blazing heat of your first frontier midday, your modern sensibilities are completely unprepared for the reality of what heat can do to the human body and mind when there's no escape from it. We think of being hot as an inconvenience, something solved by turning up the air conditioning or jumping in a pool or going inside for a cold drink. On the frontier, heat was a daily battle for survival, and many people lost that battle. The psychological effect of knowing that there's no escape, no relief, no way to just go inside and cool down, creates a level of despair that modern people rarely experience. You can't even look forward to the evening because you know that the heat retained in the buildings and the ground will make the night almost as miserable as the day. And this is just one day. Tomorrow will be just as hot or hotter. Next week will bring the same torture. For months at a time, from late spring through early fall, this heat will be your constant companion and enemy. Many frontier settlers, faced with the prospect of enduring another summer like this, simply gave up and abandoned their claims, their investments, and their dreams. Those who stayed often paid a terrible price. Chronic dehydration led to kidney problems. Repeated heat exhaustion caused long-term health issues. The constant stress on the cardiovascular system from working in extreme heat aged people prematurely and contributed to early death from heart problems. As you struggle through the blazing heat of your first frontier midday, your modern sensibilities are completely unprepared for the reality of what heat can do to the human body and mind when there's no escape from it. This isn't just discomfort. This is a form of slow torture that tests the absolute limits of human endurance. And we haven't even talked about what happens when you add drought conditions, when even the contaminated water sources dry up completely, or when prairie fires, driven by the heat and wind, race across the landscape faster than a horse can run, turning the entire horizon into a wall of flame.
As the afternoon heat reaches its murderous peak, you discover that the blazing sun isn't the only thing trying to kill you out here. The frontier is home to creatures that see you as either a threat to be eliminated or a meal to be consumed, and your modern urban sensibilities have left you completely unprepared for the reality of being part of the food chain again. Let's start with the rattlesnakes, because they're probably the most immediate danger you'll face. These aren't the occasional snake sightings you might encounter on a modern hiking trail. The frontier was absolutely crawling with rattlesnakes. They hide under rocks and tall grass, in the shade of buildings, anywhere they can escape the heat. And they're not just dangerous because of their venom. They're aggressive, territorial, and surprisingly fast when they decide you're a threat. A rattlesnake bite on the frontier was essentially a death sentence. There was no antivenom, no medical treatment beyond maybe trying to cut open the bite and suck out the poison, a technique that was not only useless but often made things worse by introducing infection. The venom would cause excruciating pain, massive swelling, tissue death, and usually a slow, agonizing demise over several days. But here's what makes it even worse. you can't see them coming most of the time. That warning rattle that everyone talks about? Snakes don't always give you that courtesy, especially if they're surprised or feel cornered. You might step on one while walking through tall grass, reach into a wood pile where one is hiding, or simply get too close to a snake that's having a bad day. One moment you're going about your work, the next moment you're looking at a bite that will probably kill you. The psychological effect of knowing that every step you take could be your last is something that would drive modern people to complete paranoia. Imagine trying to work, to concentrate on complex tasks, when you know that the ground beneath your feet might contain a creature that can kill you with a single bite. Frontier people developed a hyper-awareness that bordered on mental illness, constantly scanning the ground, listening for sounds, unable to ever truly relax. Then there are the bears. Black bears and grizzly bears were common throughout much of the frontier, and they weren't the relatively timid creatures you might encounter in a modern national park. These were wild animals that had never learned to fear humans, and they were often aggressive, hungry, and territorial. A grizzly bear encounter was almost always fatal without modern weapons and medical care. These animals could weigh over 800 pounds, run faster than a horse for short distances, and had claws that could disembowel a person with a single swipe. Even if you survived the initial attack, which was unlikely, the massive trauma and blood loss would probably kill you long before you could get any kind of medical attention. But bears didn't just attack randomly. They were attracted to human settlements by the smell of food. Your camp, your cabin, anywhere you stored supplies was essentially a dinner invitation to every bear in the area. They would tear through wooden walls like paper, destroy months' worth of carefully hoarded food supplies, and sometimes kill anyone who got in their way. The stories from frontier survivors describe bears breaking into cabins while families cowered inside, helpless to stop them. Imagine lying in your bed at night, hearing the sounds of a massive predator just outside your thin wooden walls, knowing that if it decides to come inside, there's absolutely nothing you can do to stop it. Modern people who are afraid of bumps in the night have no concept of what real fear feels like. Mountain lions, also called cougars or pumas, presented a different kind of terror. These cats are ambush predators. They stalk their prey silently, often for hours before attacking with lightning speed. You might never know a mountain lion was hunting you until you felt its claws sink into your back and its teeth close around your neck. Unlike bears, which were at least visible when they attacked, mountain lions were ghosts. They could follow you for miles without making a sound, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Frontier people reported the unsettling feeling of being watched, of seeing movement in their peripheral vision, of finding cat tracks around their camps in the morning, evidence that a predator had been studying them while they slept. A mountain lion attack was usually fatal, not because of the size of the animal, they're much smaller than bears, but because of their hunting technique. They go for the neck and spine, trying to sever the spinal cord or major blood vessels. Even if you survived the attack, the neck and back injuries would likely leave you paralyzed or brain damaged, which on the frontier was just a slower form of death sentence. Wolves were another constant threat, especially during winter months when their normal prey became scarce. Contrary to modern beliefs about wolves being afraid of humans, frontier wolves were often bold and aggressive, especially when hunting in packs. A pack of hungry wolves could bring down a horse, surround a cabin for days, or hunt humans who were traveling alone. The psychological warfare that wolves waged was almost worse than their physical attacks. They would howl around settlements all night, creating a soundtrack of terror that prevented sleep and frayed nerves to the breaking point. People reported hearing wolves testing doors and windows, scratching at walls, trying to find ways into buildings. The knowledge that a pack of predators was actively trying to get to you created a level of stress that modern people simply cannot comprehend. Even the smaller predators could kill you on the frontier. Wildcats, foxes, and even large birds of prey could carry diseases like rabies that were invariably fatal without modern medical treatment. A simple scratch from a rabid animal would lead to one of the most horrific deaths imaginable: progressive neurological deterioration, inability to swallow water, violent spasms, and eventual death. But it wasn't just the large predators you had to worry about. The frontier was home to creatures that could kill you in ways that would never occur to a modern person. Scorpions hide in shoes, bedding, and clothing, delivering stings that cause excruciating pain, paralysis, and sometimes death. Black widow spiders, brown recluse spiders, and other venomous arachnids were common in frontier buildings, and their bites could cause tissue necrosis, organ failure, and death. Even insects could be deadly. Ticks carried Rocky Mountain spotted fever, a disease that killed a significant percentage of those who contracted it. Mosquitoes spread malaria and yellow fever. Flies carried typhoid, cholera, and dysentery. The very air seemed to buzz with tiny creatures that wanted to drink your blood and potentially kill you in the process. The psychological effect of living under constant threat from the natural world cannot be overstated. Modern people who are afraid of spiders or snakes have no idea what it's like to live in an environment where these fears are not only rational, but essential for survival. Every shadow could hide a predator. Every sound in the night could signal an attack. Every step outside could be your last. This constant hypervigilance took a tremendous toll on mental health. Frontier people developed what we would now recognize as severe anxiety disorders, post-traumatic stress, and paranoia. They slept with weapons within arm's reach, barricaded their doors at night, and lived in a state of perpetual fear that would be considered pathological by modern standards. The isolation made everything worse. If a bear attacked your neighbor, you might not find out about it for weeks or months. There was no way to warn others about dangerous animals in the area, no system for tracking predator movements, no organized response to dangerous situations. You were completely on your own, with nothing but your wits and whatever primitive weapons you could afford. Children were especially vulnerable to predator attacks, but frontier families had no choice but to send them outside to do necessary chores. Kids as young as 6 or 7 were responsible for tasks that took them away from the relative safety of buildings, gathering firewood, checking on animals, fetching water from distant sources. The number of children who simply disappeared, presumably taken by predators, was staggering. Even domestic animals offered little protection. Dogs were often killed by the same predators that threatened humans. Horses, despite their size, could be brought down by wolves or bears. Cattle were constantly at risk, and losing livestock to predators meant economic disaster for families that depended on those animals for survival. The weapons available to frontier settlers were primitive and unreliable compared to modern firearms. Single-shot rifles that took precious time to reload, pistols with limited range and accuracy, knives and axes that required you to get dangerously close to whatever was threatening you. If you missed your one shot at a charging bear or attacking mountain lion, you were probably going to die. Even if you managed to kill a threatening predator, you weren't safe. The sound of gunfire or the smell of blood often attracted other predators to the area. Killing one bear might bring its mate looking for revenge. Shooting a wolf might bring the rest of the pack. Every solution created new problems. Every victory was temporary. As your first frontier afternoon wears on and you realize that every moment outside puts you at risk from creatures that see you as food, the romantic image of the Wild West continues to crumble. This isn't the adventurous frontier of movies and books. This is a place where humans are no longer at the top of the food chain, where every day is a battle for survival against creatures that are faster, stronger, and better adapted to this harsh environment than you could ever be. And night is coming, when the predators become even more active, when your visibility drops to almost nothing, when the sounds of the wilderness take on a more sinister tone. The afternoon heat that seemed like your greatest enemy is about to give way to dangers that will make you long for the simple torture of blazing sun.
As the sun begins its descent toward the western horizon, you might think that the worst of your frontier ordeal is behind you. The murderous heat is finally starting to ease. The predators are presumably settling down for the evening, and you can look forward to some rest after 16 hours of back-breaking labor. But if you think that, you're about to learn one of the harshest lessons of frontier life. Nighttime is when the real terror begins.
The first thing you notice as darkness approaches is how complete it is. Modern people have never experienced true darkness. Even in the most remote locations today, there's usually some ambient light from distant cities, streetlights, or buildings. But on the frontier, when the sun goes down, you're plunged into an absolute blackness that is both disorienting and terrifying. There are no electric lights, no street lamps, no illuminated signs. If you have a candle or an oil lamp, you're lucky, but these create tiny bubbles of flickering light that only make the surrounding darkness seem more impenetrable. The light from your pathetic flame extends maybe 6 feet in any direction, leaving you essentially blind to anything beyond that small circle. This darkness isn't just inconvenient, it's actively dangerous. You can't see obstacles, holes, cliffs, or ravines that could cripple or kill you if you take a wrong step. You can't spot predators approaching until they're close enough to attack. You can't distinguish between a rustling bush and a potential threat. Every sound becomes magnified and sinister when you can't see what's causing it. The sounds of the frontier night are unlike anything modern people have experienced. This isn't the gentle chirping of crickets and the distant hum of traffic that city dwellers are used to. This is a symphony of potential death. The howling of wolves, the screaming of mountain lions, the grunting and snuffling of bears, the rattling of snakes, and dozens of other sounds that you can't identify, but that all seem to suggest something large and dangerous moving through the darkness just beyond your sight. Coyotes create perhaps the most unsettling soundtrack of all. Their howls and yips echo across the prairie in a way that makes it impossible to determine how many there are or where they're located. Are those sounds coming from one coyote or 20? Are they a mile away or just outside your shelter? The acoustic properties of the open landscape distort sound in ways that make distance impossible to judge, leaving you constantly uncertain about the proximity of potential threats. Sleep becomes almost impossible under these conditions. Even if you're exhausted from the day's labor, and you will be, the combination of unfamiliar sounds, complete darkness, and the knowledge that predators are active at night makes it nearly impossible to relax enough for rest. You lie there in whatever primitive shelter you've managed to construct, every muscle tense, starting at every sound, your heart racing with adrenaline every time you hear something move outside. The shelters themselves offer little comfort or protection. If you're lucky enough to have a cabin, it's probably made of logs with gaps between them that let in cold air, insects, and sometimes small animals. The doors are held shut with simple latches that wouldn't stop a determined animal, much less a human intruder. The windows, if there are any, are just openings covered with cloth or thin wooden shutters that could be torn away easily. Most frontier travelers didn't even have that much protection. They slept in tents made of canvas that offered no real barrier against anything larger than an insect. Or they slept in the open, wrapped in blankets, completely exposed to whatever dangers the night might bring. Imagine trying to sleep knowing that only a thin piece of cloth separates you from bears, wolves, mountain lions, and human predators. The cold adds another layer of misery to frontier nights. Those extreme temperature swings that made the days so brutal work in reverse after sunset. The temperature can drop 40 or 50 degrees in a few hours, leaving you shivering in clothes that are still damp with sweat from the day's heat. Your body, already exhausted and dehydrated, struggles to maintain its core temperature. Hypothermia becomes a real risk, especially if you don't have adequate bedding or shelter. Your primitive blankets, if you have any, are probably thin and full of holes. There are no sleeping bags, no insulated clothing, no central heating to fall back on. You might try to build a fire for warmth, but fires attract attention from both animals and human predators, and they require constant tending to keep them burning through the night. The psychological effects of these brutal nights compound quickly. Sleep deprivation affects your judgment, your reflexes, your ability to make decisions under stress. After just a few nights of poor sleep, you're operating in a state of chronic exhaustion that makes every other aspect of frontier life more dangerous. You're more likely to make mistakes, more prone to accidents, less able to defend yourself if threatened.
Human predators are often more dangerous at night than animal ones. Bandits, rustlers, and other criminals prefer to operate under cover of darkness. They might approach your camp silently, steal your horses or supplies, and leave you stranded and doomed. Or they might decide that it's easier to kill you and take everything rather than risk you identifying them later. The isolation that makes frontier nights so terrifying also makes them more dangerous. If you're attacked, injured, or robbed during the night, there's no one to help you, no authorities to call, no neighbors close enough to hear your screams. You're completely on your own in the darkness, and help might be days or weeks away, even if someone eventually notices you're missing. Weather adds another dimension of danger to frontier nights. Sudden thunderstorms can bring torrential rain, hail, or tornadoes with little warning. Without weather forecasting or sturdy shelters, you're at the mercy of whatever nature decides to throw at you. Lightning strikes are more dangerous when you're sleeping in primitive structures or out in the open. Flash floods can sweep away camps in minutes. Even trying to take care of basic biological needs becomes hazardous at night. If you need to relieve yourself, you have to venture outside your shelter into complete darkness where predators might be waiting. There are no bathrooms, no indoor plumbing, no safe, well-lit areas. Every trip outside your shelter, no matter how brief, is a risk. The darkness also makes medical emergencies more dangerous. If someone is injured or becomes ill during the night, there's no way to properly assess their condition or provide adequate care. You can't see what you're doing, you don't have proper medical supplies, and you can't travel to get help until daylight returns. A relatively minor injury that could be easily treated during the day might become fatal if it occurs at night. Food storage becomes critical at night because the smell of food attracts every predator and scavenger from miles around. But without refrigeration or secure storage, keeping food safe from animals is nearly impossible. Bears can tear through wooden walls to get to food. Smaller animals like raccoons, skunks, and rats can contaminate or destroy your supplies. Even insects can ruin food stores overnight. The mental strain of knowing that you have to endure this terror every single night for months or years is something that would break most modern people quickly. There's no weekend break, no vacation from the fear, no safe hotel to check into when you've had enough. Night after night, you face the same darkness, the same sounds, the same fears, with no end in sight, except death or abandonment of your frontier dreams. Children suffer especially during frontier nights. Young minds aren't equipped to handle the constant fear and stress of sleeping in an environment where death lurks in every shadow. Parents had to make impossible choices between keeping children close for protection or sending them to safer locations far from the frontier, often meaning they might never see them again. The lack of entertainment or distraction during the long, dark hours makes the psychological torture worse. There are no books to read by lamplight. Most people couldn't read anyway, and books were expensive luxuries. There's no music, no conversation with neighbors, no activities to take your mind off the dangers surrounding you. You're left alone with your fears and your imagination, which both tend to run wild in the darkness. Even if you manage to fall asleep, despite the fear and discomfort, your sleep is constantly interrupted by sounds that might signal danger. Every howl, every crack of a twig, every unidentified noise jolts you awake with adrenaline flooding your system. This pattern of broken, fearful sleep becomes a form of torture that accumulates over time, wearing down your physical and mental health. By the time dawn finally arrives after your first frontier night, you realize that the day's heat and labor were just the opening act. The real test of survival happens in the darkness, when you're blind, vulnerable, and completely at the mercy of a hostile environment filled with creatures that see you as either a threat or a meal. And you have to face this terror every single night, knowing that each one might be your last, that morning isn't guaranteed, that you're just one mistake or one unlucky encounter away from becoming another anonymous victim of the unforgiving frontier wilderness.
Just when you think you've experienced the worst that frontier life can throw at you,
Mother Nature decides to remind you that humans are completely powerless against the forces of weather and climate. Modern people living with weather apps, climate control, and early warning systems have no concept of what it means to be at the complete mercy of atmospheric conditions that can change from merely uncomfortable to absolutely deadly in a matter of minutes. Let's start with the thunderstorms, because they're probably the most immediate weather threat you'll face on the frontier. These aren't the gentle summer showers you might watch from your modern living room window. Prairie thunderstorms are violent, unpredictable monsters that can spawn tornadoes, produce hail the size of golf balls, and unleash lightning strikes that turn the night sky into a war zone. The lightning is particularly terrifying when you're living in primitive structures or sleeping in the open. There are no lightning rods, no modern electrical grounding systems, no safe indoor spaces to retreat to. Lightning strikes on the frontier could instantly kill you, start fires that burn down your shelter and all your possessions, or strike nearby trees that then fall and crush you. The electromagnetic pulse from close lightning strikes could also affect any metal tools or weapons you're carrying. But it's the hail that really demonstrates nature's ability to kill you quickly and without warning. Prairie hailstorms can produce ice chunks the size of baseballs or even larger, falling from the sky at speeds that can crack skulls, break bones, and kill livestock instantly. Imagine being caught in the open during a severe hailstorm with no shelter except maybe a thin canvas tent or a crude wooden structure that offers no real protection from ice bombs falling from thousands of feet above. The stories from frontier survivors describe hailstorms that killed entire herds of cattle, destroyed months' worth of crops in minutes, and left people with severe injuries that would have been easily treatable in a modern hospital, but were often fatal on the frontier. A concussion from hail, broken ribs, or internal injuries from being pummeled by ice could mean a slow, painful death with no medical care available. Tornadoes on the frontier were essentially death sentences for anyone unlucky enough to encounter one. Modern tornado warnings give us hours or days of advance notice, and we have safe rooms, storm shelters, and reinforced structures designed to withstand extreme winds. Frontier settlers had none of these advantages. Tornadoes appeared suddenly, often at night, and there was nowhere to run and nowhere to hide. The primitive structures that passed for shelter on the frontier, log cabins, sod houses, canvas tents, were no match for tornado force winds. These storms could pick up entire buildings and scatter them across miles of prairie, along with anyone who was inside. Even if you survived the initial destruction, you'd likely be left injured, exposed, and miles from any help, with all your possessions and supplies destroyed. The psychological impact of living through a tornado encounter, assuming you survived, was devastating. Knowing that these invisible, unpredictable forces could appear at any moment and destroy everything you'd worked for created a level of anxiety that modern people can barely imagine. Every dark cloud on the horizon became a potential death sentence. Flash floods were another weather-related killer that struck without warning. The flat, open terrain of much of the frontier made it impossible to see approaching floodwaters until they were almost on top of you. Streams and rivers that were dry one hour could become raging torrents the next, carrying away horses, equipment, food supplies, and people. Modern flood warning systems and emergency response teams make it hard for us to understand how helpless frontier people were against sudden flooding. There was no weather service to warn them about heavy rains upstream, no evacuation procedures, no rescue services to pull them from floodwaters. If you were caught in a flash flood, your survival depended entirely on luck and your ability to grab onto something solid and hold on until the waters receded.
Even worse, floods often contaminated water supplies and spread disease. The same floodwaters that threatened to drown you also carried animal carcasses, human waste, and other sources of contamination that could poison wells and streams for weeks or months afterward. Surviving the flood was just the beginning. Dealing with the aftermath often proved equally deadly. Droughts presented a different kind of weather-related death sentence. While floods killed quickly, droughts killed slowly through dehydration, starvation, and desperation. Extended periods without rain could dry up water sources completely, kill crops and livestock, and turn the landscape into a dusty wasteland where nothing could survive. The psychological effects of watching your water supplies dwindle day by day, knowing that death was approaching, slowly but inevitably, drove many frontier settlers to madness. Some abandoned their claims and tried to walk to areas where water might be available, often dying of thirst along the way. Others fought violently over the remaining water sources, turning neighbor against neighbor in desperate struggles for survival. Prairie fires were perhaps the most terrifying weather-related phenomenon of all. These fires could start from lightning strikes, human carelessness, or even spontaneous combustion of dry vegetation, and once they began, they moved across the landscape faster than a horse could run. The wall of flame could stretch for miles, consuming everything in its path and creating its own weather systems with hurricane-force winds. There was no fire department to call, no helicopters dropping water or flame retardant, no fire breaks or controlled burns to prevent catastrophic blazes. If you saw a prairie fire on the horizon, your only options was to run and hope you could outpace it, or try to create a fire break by burning the vegetation around your location and hope the main fire would pass you by. Many frontier settlers died horrible deaths in prairie fires, either burned alive as the flames overtook them or killed by smoke inhalation as they tried to hide in whatever shelter they could find. Even those who survived often lost everything they owned. Buildings, crops, livestock, tools, and supplies all reduced to ash in a matter of hours. Blizzards and extreme cold weather created their own special category of frontier horror. Modern people with heated homes, insulated clothing, and snow removal services can't comprehend what a winter blizzard meant to someone living in a primitive cabin or dugout shelter. These storms could dump feet of snow in a matter of hours, creating drifts that completely buried buildings and trapping people inside for days or weeks. The combination of extreme cold, limited food supplies, and inadequate heating could quickly turn a blizzard into a death trap. Frontier settlers often burned furniture, books, and even structural elements of their shelters trying to stay warm, weakening their protection against the elements while using up their fuel supplies. Carbon monoxide poisoning from poorly ventilated heating sources killed many people who survived the initial cold. Even if you had adequate fuel and food to last through a blizzard, the isolation could be deadly. If someone became seriously ill or injured during a winter storm, there was no way to get help. Medical emergencies that would be routine in modern times became fatal when combined with extreme weather and isolation. The wind on the frontier was a constant enemy that made every other weather condition worse. Prairie winds could reach hurricane force even without storms, making it difficult to walk, work, or even breathe. These winds dried out the landscape, increasing fire danger, spread diseases, and created dust storms that could blind and choke anyone caught in them. Dust storms, often called black blizzards, could turn day into night and create breathing conditions so severe that people suffocated on dry land. The fine dust got into everything: food, water, lungs, eyes, causing respiratory problems, infections, and other health issues that could prove fatal without modern medical care.
The constant wind also had psychological effects that drove many frontier settlers to mental breakdown. The endless howling, whistling, and moaning sounds created a form of auditory torture that never stopped. Many people reported that the wind seemed to be trying to drive them insane, and for some, it succeeded. Temperature extremes beyond what we've already discussed could kill in ways that modern climate control has made us forget. Summer temperatures that reached 120 degrees or more in the shade, when you could find shade, could cause heat stroke so severe that it resulted in permanent brain damage or death. Winter temperatures that dropped to 40 below zero or colder could freeze exposed skin in minutes and kill through hypothermia even if you were trying to stay warm. The lack of weather prediction made all of these dangers worse. Modern people take weather forecasts for granted, but frontier settlers had no way of knowing what conditions they might face from one day to the next. A pleasant morning could turn into a deadly afternoon with no warning. A mild evening could become a life-threatening night as temperatures plummeted. Seasonal changes brought their own cycles of weather-related death. Spring floods from snowmelt, summer heat and drought, autumn storms and early freezes, winter blizzards and extreme cold. Each season had its own way of trying to kill you, and there was no escape from the annual cycle of weather-related threats. The cumulative effect of living under constant threat from weather extremes took a tremendous toll on both physical and mental health. The stress of never knowing when the next life-threatening weather event might occur, combined with the knowledge that you had no effective protection against most weather dangers, created a level of anxiety and fatigue that shortened lives and broke spirits. As you lie in your comfortable, climate-controlled bedroom tonight, protected from whatever weather might be happening outside, remember that just a few generations ago, people lived completely at the mercy of atmospheric conditions that could kill them at any moment. The Wild West wasn't just dangerous because of outlaws and predators, it was dangerous because the very air above your head was trying to kill you in ways both sudden and slow, violent and subtle, predictable and completely unexpected. If the weather, predators, and harsh living conditions weren't enough to kill you on the frontier, there was an entire microscopic army of diseases, infections, and medical conditions that were actively trying to finish the job. Modern people living in the age of antibiotics, vaccines, and advanced medical care have no concept of what it meant to live in a world where a simple toothache could kill you, where childhood diseases claimed half of all children before their 5th birthday, and where epidemics could wipe out entire settlements in a matter of weeks. Let's start with something as basic as dental health, because this is where the horror of frontier medicine becomes immediately apparent. Modern people might avoid the dentist because they find cleanings uncomfortable, but on the frontier, dental problems were often death sentences. There were no dentists, no anesthesia, no proper tools, and no understanding of infection control. A simple cavity that you might get filled during a lunch break today could become an abscess that killed you slowly and painfully over several weeks. The infection would spread through your jawbone, into your bloodstream, and eventually to your brain or heart, causing death through sepsis. The pain was so severe that many people tried to pull their own teeth with pliers or other crude tools, often making the infection worse and hastening their own deaths. If you were lucky enough to find someone willing to attempt dental work, the experience was pure torture. Tooth extraction was performed without any pain relief, often with unsterilized tools that introduced even more infection. Many people died not from the original dental problem, but from the trauma and infection caused by the attempted treatment. Now imagine dealing with more serious medical conditions. A simple case of appendicitis, which today is handled with routine surgery, was almost always fatal on the frontier. The appendix would rupture, causing peritonitis and death within days. There was no way to diagnose the condition accurately, no surgical options, and no pain relief except maybe some whiskey if you were fortunate. Broken bones presented their own nightmare scenario. Without x-rays, proper splinting materials, or understanding of how bones heal, a simple fracture often resulted in permanent disability or death. Bones that healed incorrectly could leave you unable to work, which on the frontier meant you were unable to survive. Compound fractures, where the bone breaks through the skin, almost always became infected and frequently resulted in either amputation without anesthesia or death from blood poisoning. The amputation procedures performed on the frontier were barbaric by modern standards. The patient was held down by several strong men, while a saw was used to cut through bone and a knife was used to cut through flesh. The survival rate for these procedures was extremely low, not because of the amputation itself, but because of shock, blood loss, and the inevitable infections that followed. Childbirth was one of the most dangerous activities a woman could undertake on the frontier. Without modern obstetric care, sterile conditions, or emergency medical intervention, complications during childbirth frequently resulted in the death of both mother and child. Hemorrhaging, infection, breech presentations, and other problems that are routinely handled in modern hospitals were often fatal. The infant mortality rate on the frontier was staggering. Estimates suggest that 40 to 50% of children died before reaching their 5th birthday. Diseases that we now prevent with routine vaccinations, measles, mumps, whooping cough, diphtheria, swept through frontier communities like wildfire, killing children in agonizing ways that their parents were powerless to prevent. Whooping cough was particularly cruel, causing children to cough so violently that they would turn blue and sometimes die from lack of oxygen. Parents had to watch helplessly as their children slowly suffocated, coughing fits that went on for hours with no relief available. The sound of a child dying from whooping cough was something that haunted survivors for the rest of their lives. Diphtheria created a thick membrane in the throat that could completely block breathing, causing children to die slowly of suffocation while fully conscious. Parents sometimes tried desperate measures like cutting holes in their children's throats to help them breathe, procedures that were almost always fatal and added to the child's suffering rather than relieving it. Scarlet fever caused high fevers, severe sore throats, and a distinctive red rash. Children would burn with fever for days, become delirious, and either recover completely or die suddenly. There was no way to predict which outcome would occur, leaving families to watch and wait while their children suffered. Adult diseases were equally horrific and often fatal. Consumption, which we now know as tuberculosis, was one of the leading killers of adults on the frontier. The disease caused a slow, wasting death characterized by bloody coughing, extreme weight loss, night sweats, and gradual suffocation as the lungs filled with fluid and scar tissue. The social stigma associated with consumption was almost as bad as the disease itself. People with TB were often ostracized from your communities, left to die alone because others feared contracting the disease. Entire families could be wiped out by tuberculosis, with the disease passing from person to person in the cramped, poorly ventilated living conditions that were common on the frontier. Typhoid fever, spread through contaminated water and food, caused high fevers, severe headaches, abdominal pain, and often death within a few weeks. The disease was particularly common on the frontier because of poor sanitation and the lack of clean water sources. Entire settlements could be decimated by typhoid outbreaks, with survivors often too weak and traumatized to continue their frontier lives. Cholera was perhaps the most feared disease of all. It could kill within hours of the first symptoms appearing, causing violent vomiting, diarrhea, and dehydration so severe that victims literally dried up before their families' eyes. The speed with which cholera killed was terrifying. A person could wake up feeling fine and be dead by sunset, having suffered through hours of agony as their body expelled all its fluids. The lack of understanding about how diseases spread made epidemics even more devastating. People didn't know that cholera was spread through contaminated water, so they continued drinking from infected sources. They didn't understand that typhoid was spread through poor sanitation, so they continued the practices that perpetuated the disease. They didn't know that consumption was spread through the air, so they continued living in close quarters with infected family members. Mental illness on the frontier was both more common and more dangerous than in settled areas. The isolation, constant stress, and traumatic experiences of frontier life drove many people to what we would now recognize as severe depression, anxiety disorders, and post-traumatic stress. But there was no understanding of mental health, no treatment available, and no support systems to help people cope. People who developed mental illness were often seen as possessed, cursed, or morally weak. They were sometimes abandoned by their families, left to wander the wilderness alone until they died of exposure or starvation. Others were restrained or imprisoned by their communities, living in conditions that would be considered torture today. The combination of untreated mental illness and easy access to weapons made frontier communities dangerous places for everyone. People suffering from paranoia, delusions, or violent impulses had no way to get help and no barriers preventing them from acting on their symptoms. Murder, suicides, random violence, and self-harm were tragically common. Substance abuse was another medical crisis on the frontier. Alcohol was often safer to drink than water, so alcoholism was widespread. Patent medicines containing opium, cocaine, and other dangerous substances were freely available and heavily used. People became addicted to these substances without understanding the risks, and there were no treatment programs or support systems to help them recover. The medical treatments available on the frontier were often more dangerous than the diseases they were supposed to cure. Mercury was commonly used to treat a variety of conditions, slowly poisoning patients while providing no actual benefit. Bloodletting was still widely practiced, weakening patients who were already struggling with illness. Purgatives and emetics caused severe dehydration and malnutrition in people who needed fluids and nutrition. Many so-called medical practitioners were complete charlatans who preyed on desperate, suffering people. These snake oil salesmen sold worthless or harmful remedies, performed dangerous procedures, and disappeared before their victims could seek revenge. The lack of medical licensing or regulation meant that anyone could claim to be a doctor and start treating patients, regardless of their actual knowledge or qualifications. Even well-meaning attempts at medical care were often fatal due to the lack of understanding about infection control. Surgical instruments were not sterilized, wounds were not properly cleaned, and the same tools might be used on multiple patients without any cleaning between uses. More people probably died from medical treatment than were saved by it. The psychological impact of living in a world where any illness could be fatal created a level of anxiety and fatalism that modern people can barely comprehend. Every headache could be the beginning of typhoid fever. Every cough could be the start of consumption. Every cut could become infected and kill you. The knowledge that death could come at any moment from invisible enemies within your own body created a constant state of fear that affected every aspect of daily life. Families lived with the knowledge that they would probably lose multiple children to disease, that their own life could be cut short at any moment by illness, and that there was
Families lived with the knowledge that they would probably lose multiple children to disease, that their own lives could be cut short at any moment by illness, and that there was virtually nothing they could do to protect themselves or their loved ones. The grief and trauma of watching family members die slow, painful deaths from treatable diseases was something that marked entire generations of frontier survivors. As you rest comfortably tonight, protected by modern medicine, vaccines, antibiotics, and advanced medical care, remember that just a few generations ago, people lived in constant terror of diseases that we now consider minor inconveniences. The Wild West was a place where your own body could betray you at any moment, where microscopic enemies were more dangerous than any outlaw or predator, and where the simple act of staying alive required a kind of luck that most people didn't have. While nature and disease were busy trying to kill you in countless ways, there was another category of threat that made frontier life even more terrifying: your fellow human beings. The romantic image of the Wild West as a place of honor, justice, and noble gunfighters couldn't be further from the truth. This was a lawless wilderness where violence was casual, justice was arbitrary, and human life had almost no value whatsoever. Let's start with the reality of frontier law enforcement, because this is where Hollywood has created perhaps its most damaging mythology. There were no professional police forces, no trained investigators, no forensic science, and no consistent legal system. What passed for law enforcement was usually just whoever happened to be the toughest, most ruthless person in a given area. And their idea of justice was whatever they felt like doing on any particular day. Most frontier towns didn't have sheriffs or marshals like you see in the movies. They had no one. If someone robbed you, assaulted you, or murdered your family, there was literally no one to report it to and no system in place to seek justice or compensation. You were completely on your own, and your only options were to absorb the loss and try to survive, or to seek revenge yourself and risk becoming a target for retaliation. When there were people calling themselves lawmen, they were often more dangerous than the criminals they were supposedly fighting. Many frontier sheriffs were former outlaws themselves, men who had simply decided that wearing a badge was more profitable than robbing banks. They used their authority to steal, extort, and murder with complete impunity, knowing that there was no higher authority to hold them accountable. The concept of due process, trial by jury, or legal representation was completely foreign to most frontier communities. Justice was dispensed quickly and violently, often by mobs who made decisions based on emotion, prejudice, and incomplete information. If someone accused you of stealing a horse and the community decided you looked guilty, you might find yourself hanging from a tree within hours, regardless of whether you had actually committed any crime. Lynching was not only common, but was often considered a form of entertainment. Entire families would gather to watch executions, treating them like social events. Children were brought along to witness the hangings, and the brutal spectacle was considered educational, a way to teach young people about the consequences of crossing the community. The racial violence on the frontier was particularly horrific. Native Americans, African Americans, Chinese immigrants, and Mexican settlers faced levels of brutality that would be considered genocide by modern standards. Entire communities could be wiped out overnight by groups of white settlers who faced no consequences for mass murder. The dehumanization of anyone who wasn't white and Christian made violence against them not only acceptable, but often profitable. Claim jumping was one of the most common forms of violence, and it perfectly illustrates how the absence of law made every interaction potentially deadly. If you found a good piece of land, discovered gold, or established a profitable business, there was nothing stopping stronger, more ruthless people from simply taking it from you. They might kill you and your family and claim that you had abandoned the property, or they might drive you off through intimidation and violence. The constant threat of having everything stolen meant that successful people had to become dangerous themselves or hire protection from men who were essentially professional criminals. This created a cycle of violence where everyone had to be prepared to kill or be killed over property disputes, business disagreements, or personal grudges. Women faced particular dangers on the frontier, where they were seen as property rather than people, and had virtually no legal protection from assault, rape, or murder. A woman traveling alone, or even with inadequate male protection, was essentially defenseless against any man who decided to attack her. The isolation of frontier life meant that these crimes often went unwitnessed and unpunished. Domestic violence was not only common, but was considered a man's right. A husband could beat, rape, or even kill his wife with little fear of legal consequences. Women who tried to leave abusive situations had nowhere to go and no resources to survive on their own. Many chose to endure horrific abuse rather than face the certainty of death from exposure, starvation, or violence if they tried to escape. Children were also victims of casual violence that would horrify modern people. child labor was not only common, but necessary for survival. And children who couldn't work hard enough were often beaten, abandoned, or sold to other families like property. Sexual abuse of children was widespread and rarely punished, especially when the perpetrators were adults with economic or social power in the community. The saloons that feature prominently in Western movies were actually centers of violence, where drunken men settled disputes with knives and guns. Arguments over card games, women, or imagined slights regularly escalated to deadly violence. The combination of alcohol, weapons, and men under extreme stress from frontier life created an atmosphere where murder was a nightly occurrence. Gambling disputes were particularly deadly because they involved money that people desperately needed to survive. Accusations of cheating, whether true or false, were often death sentences for everyone involved. The primitive weapons of the era, single-shot firearms, knives, and clubs, meant that fights were brutal, personal affairs where participants literally beat or stabbed each other to death. Road agents, as highway robbers were called, made travel between settlements extremely dangerous. These weren't the romanticized gentleman bandits of popular fiction. They were desperate, violent criminals who would kill travelers for the clothes on their backs. Stagecoach robberies often ended in mass murder, with entire passenger loads killed to prevent anyone from identifying the robbers. The lack of communication between settlements meant that serial killers could operate with impunity, moving from town to town and leaving trails of bodies behind them. There were no wanted posters, no way to warn other communities about dangerous individuals, and no coordinated law enforcement efforts to track down criminals. Vigilante groups, which Hollywood often portrays as heroic citizens fighting for justice, were actually terror organizations that used violence to enforce their own economic and social interests. They might lynch someone for stealing a horse while ignoring the crimes of wealthy community members. Their version of justice was based on social standing, race, and economic power, rather than actual guilt or innocence. The economic desperation that drove many people to the frontier also drove them to crime. People who had never committed violent acts in civilized areas found themselves robbing, cheating, and killing just to survive. The moral constraints that work in stable societies broke down completely under the pressure of life or death survival situations. Claim disputes often escalated into small wars between families or groups, with multiple generations carrying on blood feuds that claimed dozens of lives over trivial disagreements about property boundaries or water rights. These conflicts could last for years, making entire regions unsafe for anyone not directly involved in the fighting. The weapons available to frontier settlers were primitive but deadly. Single-shot firearms that took precious time to reload, knives designed for utility rather than fighting, and improvised weapons made from farming tools. This meant that violent encounters were often prolonged, brutal affairs where participants literally hacked each other to death with axes, hammers, and other crude implements. Even something as simple as a business disagreement could turn deadly when there were no courts to settle disputes and no police to maintain order. Partners might kill each other over profit sharing. Customers might murder merchants over prices, and competitors might eliminate rivals through assassination rather than economic competition. The psychological effects of living in this environment of constant violence cannot be overstated. People developed what we would now recognize as severe post-traumatic stress, paranoia, and antisocial behaviors as coping mechanisms for survival. Children who grew up witnessing casual murder and brutality often became violent themselves, perpetuating cycles of trauma and criminality. The isolation of frontier life made violence more likely and more severe. In settled areas, social pressure and the presence of witnesses might prevent or limit violent acts. On the frontier, people could commit the most horrific crimes with no witnesses and no consequences. This created an environment where the most brutal and ruthless individuals thrived, while decent people either fled
or were killed. Territory disputes between different ethnic groups, business interests, and religious communities sometimes escalated into genocidal violence that wiped out entire settlements. These conflicts were fought with a brutality that shocked even hardened frontier veterans, with atrocities committed by all sides that would be considered war crimes by modern standards. The legal concept of self-defense was interpreted so broadly on the frontier that almost any violence could be justified by claiming
The legal concept of self-defense was interpreted so broadly on the frontier that almost any violence could be justified by claiming that you felt threatened. This created a situation where paranoid, violent individuals could murder with impunity by simply claiming that their victims had posed some kind of threat. As you lie in your safe, secure home tonight, protected by professional police forces, a functioning legal system, and social structures that discourage violence, remember that just a few generations ago, people lived in a world where might made right, where justice was whatever the strongest person said it was, and where human life was cheaper than the bullets used to end it. The Wild West wasn't a place of heroic gunfighters and noble lawmen. It was a hellscape where the most violent, ruthless, and morally bankrupt individuals held power over everyone else, and where decent people lived in constant fear of becoming the next victims of casual, unpunished brutality.
If you somehow managed to survive the blazing heat, deadly predators, contaminated water, brutal work, terrible diseases, and constant violence of frontier life through spring, summer, and fall, you then face the ultimate test of survival: winter. And I'm not talking about the mild inconvenience of scraping ice off your car windshield or paying higher heating bills. I'm talking about months of cold so severe it could literally freeze you to death in your own bed, in conditions that would kill most modern people within days. Frontier winters weren't just cold, they were a sustained attempt by nature to erase human life from the landscape entirely. Temperatures could drop to 40, 50, or even 60 degrees below zero and stay there for weeks at a time. At those temperatures, exposed skin freezes in minutes. Metal becomes so cold it can burn you on contact, and your breath freezes in the air before it can leave your lungs. Modern people living with central heating, insulated homes, and electric blankets have no concept of what it means to be truly cold. The kind of cold where every breath hurts, where your body starts shutting down non-essential functions to preserve your core temperature, where you can literally feel death creeping through your extremities as frostbite begins to set in. The shelters that frontier people lived in were pathetically inadequate for these conditions. Log cabins might sound sturdy, but they were usually built quickly, with gaps between the logs that let in wind and snow. The chinking, mud, grass, or whatever else was available to fill the gaps would shrink and fall out during the winter, leaving holes that turned homes into wind tunnels filled with swirling snow. Sod houses, which were common on the treeless prairie, were even worse. These were basically caves dug into hillsides, or structures made from blocks of prairie sod stacked like bricks. They leaked constantly, were infested with insects and rodents, and provided minimal insulation against the brutal cold. Families would wake up to find snow drifted inside their homes, ice coating the walls, and their water supplies frozen solid. Heating these primitive shelters was a constant, desperate battle for survival. Wood was scarce on much of the frontier, especially on the Great Plains where trees were rare. Families burned everything they could find: furniture, books, parts of their own homes, dried animal dung, twisted bundles of prairie grass. The fuel burned quickly and provided little heat, requiring constant attention to keep fires going through the night. But here's the truly terrifying part. If your fire went out during a blizzard, you would probably freeze to death before you could get it restarted. Matches were expensive and unreliable, and lighting fires in extreme cold with numb fingers and primitive materials was nearly impossible.
Many frontier families died huddled together in their beds after their fires went out during particularly brutal cold snaps. Carbon monoxide poisoning was another winter killer that people didn't understand at the time. Desperate families would bring burning materials inside their shelters or seal up their homes too tightly to retain heat, creating conditions where deadly gases would build up and kill everyone while they slept. They would simply go to bed and never wake up, victims of an invisible killer they didn't know existed. Food storage and preparation became almost impossible in extreme cold. Wells froze solid, sometimes to depths of 10 or 15 feet, making water unavailable for weeks at a time. Families melted snow for water, but snow contains very little actual water, so you needed enormous amounts of snow to get enough water for cooking and drinking. And collecting that snow meant venturing outside into potentially deadly conditions. Preserved foods that families had worked all summer and fall to prepare would freeze so hard they became inedible. Salt pork would freeze into blocks that couldn't be cut with knives. Beans and grains would freeze and sometimes crack or spoil when they thawed. Families might have adequate food supplies, but be unable to prepare them for eating due to the extreme conditions. The isolation created by winter storms was psychologically devastating and often fatal. Blizzards could last for days or weeks, depositing snow so deep that it buried entire buildings and made travel impossible. Families would be trapped in their inadequate shelters for months at a time, with no contact with neighbors, no way to get help if someone became sick or injured, and no relief from the constant cold and fear. Children and elderly people were particularly vulnerable to winter conditions. Their bodies couldn't generate or retain heat as effectively as healthy adults, and they would often develop frostbite, hypothermia, or respiratory infections that proved fatal. Parents had to make horrible decisions about rationing warmth, food, and fuel, knowing that their choices might determine who lived and who died. Livestock that families depended on for survival often died in massive numbers during harsh winters. Cattle, horses, pigs, and chickens would freeze to death despite their owners' best efforts to protect them. These weren't just economic losses, they were death sentences for families who depended on these animals for transportation, food, and farm labor. The psychological effects of frontier winters were as deadly as the physical conditions. Seasonal depression, cabin fever, and what we now recognize as severe anxiety disorders were common among people trapped in small spaces under life-threatening conditions for months at a time. Some people went completely insane from the isolation and stress, sometimes becoming violent toward their own family members. Suicide rates skyrocketed during winter months as people faced the reality of slow starvation, gradual freezing, or watching their loved ones die from conditions they were powerless to prevent. Some families made suicide pacts rather than endure the slow torture of freezing and starving to death. Others simply walked out into blizzards, preferring quick death from exposure to the prolonged agony of winter survival. Medical emergencies during winter were automatically fatal because there was no way to get help. A broken bone, a difficult childbirth, or a serious illness that might be survivable under normal conditions became death sentences when no doctor could reach you and you couldn't travel to get help. Families watched helplessly as their loved ones died from treatable conditions. Even basic hygiene became impossible during the worst winter weather. People couldn't bathe for months at a time, leading to skin infections, lice infestations, and other health problems that weakened their immune systems and made them more susceptible to serious illnesses. The psychological impact of living in filthy conditions while trapped with the same people for months created additional stress and conflict. The spring thaw, when it finally came, often brought new dangers in the form of flooding from melting snow and ice. Families who had survived the winter might lose their homes and possessions to floodwaters, or find themselves stranded on islands of high ground surrounded by dangerous currents. Some people died in spring floods after surviving months of winter hardship. Even preparing for winter was a year-round struggle that most people failed at.
You needed to accumulate enough food, fuel, warm clothing, and other supplies to last for 6 to 8 months. But the primitive frontier economy made this nearly impossible. Most families went into winter already knowing they didn't have enough resources to survive, but having no choice except to hope for an unusually mild season. The clothing available to frontier people was completely inadequate for extreme cold. Wool was expensive and often unavailable, cotton provided no insulation when wet, and synthetic materials didn't exist. People wore layer after layer of whatever fabric they could find, but their clothing was often damp from snow and sweat, which actually made them colder and more likely to develop frostbite. Frostbite was incredibly common and often led to amputations performed without anesthesia or proper medical tools. People would lose fingers, toes, hands, or feet to freezing, leaving them permanently disabled and less able to work and survive. The pain of severe frostbite was excruciating, and the risk of infection from frostbitten tissue was extremely high. The work that had to be done during winter to survive was almost impossible under the conditions. Animals still needed to be fed and cared for, water still needed to be obtained somehow, fuel still needed to be gathered and prepared. But doing this work in extreme cold while inadequately clothed and sheltered meant that every necessary task became a risk to life and limb. Many frontier settlements were completely abandoned during harsh winters, as people either died or fled to more survivable locations. Ghost towns across the West are testament to communities that couldn't survive the winter conditions, leaving behind empty buildings and sometimes the frozen bodies of those who waited too long to leave. The children who did survive frontier winters were often permanently affected by the experience. They might suffer from frostbite injuries that left them disabled, malnutrition that stunted their growth, or psychological trauma from watching family members die from conditions they were powerless to prevent. Many developed what we would now recognize as severe anxiety disorders that affected them for the rest of their lives. As you lie in your warm, comfortable bed tonight, with heat that comes at the flip of a switch, and insulation that keeps out the cold without any effort on your part, try to imagine spending months in conditions where every day might be your last, where warmth was a precious
As you lie in your warm, comfortable bed tonight, with heat that comes at the flip of a switch, and insulation that keeps out the cold without any effort on your part, try to imagine spending months in conditions where every day might be your last, where warmth was a precious resource that had to be rationed carefully, and where the simple act of staying alive required more courage and endurance than most modern people possess. The Wild West winter wasn't just another season. It was nature's final exam, and most people failed it fatally.
And so, we reached the end of our journey through the real Wild West. And if you've stayed with me through this entire exploration, you now understand something that most people never truly grasp. Just how incredibly fortunate you are to be living in this moment in history, in this place, with all the modern conveniences that keep you alive and comfortable without you even thinking about them. Think about everything we've covered tonight. The brutal awakening at dawn in flea-infested blankets on frozen ground, the contaminated water that could kill you with every sip, the constant threat of predators that saw you as nothing more than another meal, the back-breaking labor that literally worked people to death, the blazing heat with no escape and no relief, the complete darkness filled with the sounds of things that wanted to kill you, the weather that could destroy you in minutes without warning, the diseases that turned minor ailments into death sentences, the violence and lawlessness where human life had no value, and finally, the winters that tested the absolute limits of human endurance and found most people wanting. Every single day on the frontier was a battle for survival against forces that were actively trying to end your life. You weren't living, you were just trying not to die, hour by hour, day by day, season by season. And the vast majority of people who attempted this lifestyle didn't make it. The romantic stories we tell about the Wild West are the rare exceptions, the tiny percentage of people who survived long enough to tell their tales. But here's what's truly remarkable about your life right now, as you lie in your comfortable bed listening to this story. You have defeated every single one of those frontier killers without even trying, without even thinking about it, simply by being born in the right place at the right time. The clean water that flows from your tap whenever you want it would have been worth more than gold to a frontier settler dying of thirst. The food in your refrigerator and pantry represents more variety, nutrition, and safety than frontier people could have imagined in their wildest dreams. The electric lights that banish darkness at the flip of a switch would have seemed like pure magic to people who lived in fear of what lurked in the shadows. Your climate-controlled home protects you from temperature extremes that routinely killed hardy frontier survivors. Your comfortable mattress, clean sheets, and warm blankets provide better sleep than the wealthiest frontier settler could buy. Your indoor plumbing eliminates health hazards that killed thousands of people just trying to take care of basic human needs. The medical care available to you, antibiotics that cure infections that were once death sentences, vaccines that prevent diseases that terrorized entire communities, surgical techniques that can save you from injuries that would have been automatically fatal, represents centuries of accumulated knowledge that makes you essentially immortal compared to frontier people. The police and emergency services that protect you, the legal system that ensures justice, the communication networks that can summon help instantly, all of these create a bubble of safety and security that frontier people couldn't even dream of. You live in a world where violence is the exception rather than the rule, where disputes are settled with words rather than weapons, where help is always just a phone call away. Even your job, no matter how stressful it might seem sometimes, is infinitely safer, more comfortable, and more rewarding than the deadly labor that frontier people had to perform just to survive another day. You work in climate-controlled environments with safety regulations, health insurance, and legal protections that would have seemed like paradise to someone trying to make a living in the Wild West. The transportation that gets you safely from place to place, the infrastructure that delivers power and water and communication to your home, the economic systems that ensure food is always available. These are all miracles of modern civilization that protect you from dangers you don't even know exist. But perhaps most importantly, you have something that frontier people almost never had: the luxury of worrying about problems that aren't immediately life-threatening. Your stress comes from deadlines and relationships and social media and career concerns, challenges that, while real and important to you, would have seemed like blessed problems to have to someone whose biggest daily worry was whether they would live to see another sunrise. The very fact that you can lie in bed at night listening to stories about historical hardships rather than actually experiencing those hardships yourself is a privilege that represents the collective efforts of thousands of generations of humans who gradually built the civilization that now protects and nurtures you. So why do we romanticize the Wild West? Why do we tell stories about brave pioneers and noble cowboys when the reality was so much harsher? I think it's because we need these myths to help us make sense of our own comfortable lives. We tell ourselves stories about rugged individualism and frontier courage because it makes us feel connected to something larger and more meaningful than our daily routines. But the truth is that you're living the dream that every frontier settler was working toward. They endured the hardships and dangers and death precisely because they hoped that someday, somehow, their children or their children's children would live in safety and comfort and abundance. They sacrificed everything so that you could have everything. The house you live in, the job you work at, the food you eat, the water you drink, the air you breathe, all of it is cleaner, safer, more abundant, and more comfortable than anything the wealthiest frontier family could have imagined in their wildest dreams. You live better than kings lived just a few centuries ago. And that's something worth being grateful for as you drift off to sleep tonight. You don't have to worry about predators outside your window, or whether you'll have water to drink tomorrow, or if the roof over your head will protect you from the next storm. You don't have to ration heat in the winter, or endure brutal labor in the summer, or fear that a simple cut might kill you. Instead, you can let your mind relax, let your body settle into comfort that frontier people could never have experienced, and allow yourself to sink into the kind of deep, peaceful sleep that was almost impossible when every sound in the darkness might signal approaching death. The Wild West was a harsh, brutal, unforgiving place where most people died young and lived hard lives filled with suffering that we can barely comprehend today. But you're not there. You're here. You're safe. You're comfortable. And you're protected by centuries of human progress and ingenuity. So close your eyes, appreciate the miracle of your modern life, and drift peacefully into sleep, grateful for every convenience that keeps you alive and comfortable without you even thinking about it. The Wild West is just a story now, and you're living the happy ending that all those brave, doomed settlers were dreaming of as they struggled to survive just one more day in the unforgiving American West.